Well, it's great to have another opportunity to have a discussion with someone who is a dear student of history. And I think we're going to be in for a real treat. And that's because our guest today is Darryl Cooper of the Martyr podcast. How you doing, sir?
Doing well, man. Glad to hear you guys are at least staying on your feet a bit with the hurricane out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm doing well. It's been too long since we've hopped on here.
Yeah, and I know that you've been quite the busy man in a lot of different areas right now, but I do appreciate your time to kind of really get your thoughts and get an inside look at what was going on. Recently, I was on this kind of 5 week trip, and I remember I was in some gas station or something. I think it was in Arkansas or Missouri or somewhere. And I looked up and I saw that I was going to put on some audio on the car to drive that you had done an interview with Tucker Carlson. And I said, "Oh, this is awesome. Darryl Cooper's on Tucker Carlson show. This is going to be awesome." So I turned it on and I'm listening to it, and all of a sudden I hear you give this exploration of Rene Girard, mimetic theory, and you start going into what it means, and you were explaining the scapegoat mechanism, and I was like, wow, that's awesome because it's always been something I've wanted folks like Joe Rogan and Tucker and everybody to kind of really get on board with exploring mimetic theory and Rene Girard and what some of the ideas have in terms of understanding the meaning of history. And there you were moving the needle and pushing Rene Girard into that. So tell me a little bit about that whole experience up to that point where you're going through. And were you prepared? Were you wanting to come on to talk to Tucker about Rene Girard, or how did that whole thing go?
Well, Rene Girard's work, it just sort of sits in the not even the back of my mind, like somewhere in the middle rows, like at all times, you know. And I don't really get away from it almost no matter what I'm reading about or thinking about. And so you could start me on a conversation about a lot of things, and there's a good chance at some point, if you keep me there long enough, I'm gonna take the conversation in that direction. So I didn't go in with a plan, but if you would have asked me what are the 5 or 10 most likely topics you'll bring up, that definitely would have been one of them. Because
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's one thing that's nice about coming on your shows. I know you're like you personally, obviously, but your audience as well has familiarity with a lot of the concepts, and so we can actually just kind of dive in without spending the entire time
Right.
just explaining who Rene Girard
Yeah.
was, et cetera. That's one of the reasons I love coming on your show.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we are one of the few that actually does dedicates a program each week at least trying to do something with mimetic anthropology. And so we of course we're always glad, it's like when you're in the indie scene, you're always glad to hear your idea that that's your niche. You start hitting the Tucker Carlson zeitgeist, Joe Rogan zeitgeist. Hopefully that's what you were able to kind of plant a seed there with that conversation. That's the first time. Were you aware if Tucker actually knew about Rene Girard prior to the interview, or you had no idea?
He before
Yeah,
I can't remember. I don't think we talked about it at dinner the night before. I don't think we've discussed it before.
yeah,
So I don't know. He might have like, I mean, he's well read actually,
yeah,
much more than I expected. I mean, obviously he's a smart guy and a clever TV personality, but you never know, how deep that goes uh, until you have dinner with somebody in their library, like I did with
yeah,
Tucker, and you see the books and they're well worn and realize that, he puts a lot of time in. And so he had, I'm sure, like a certain familiarity with him, but
yeah,
not as one who has really had the Girard experience, so to speak.
yeah, yeah. Now I know he recently had on a reformed minister named Pastor Douglas Wilson out of Idaho, Moscow,
Yeah,
Idaho,
yeah, right. I
and
know some guys who are from Moscow who know that guy. It's
yeah,
say he's solid as a rock.
yeah, and Douglas Wilson, I've interviewed him years ago, back in like 2008 or nine when I was first doing radio, and he's a longtime fan of Rene Girard as well. And so I don't know if maybe if that I don't think they didn't talk about it at least in the recorded interview with him, but Doug is a big advocate of Rene Girard. He always has a line saying, "It's all in Girard, man." That's like his line.
Yeah.
It's all in Girard.
Yeah. I
And
mean, you don't want to, you got to be wary on, some to some degree of falling into that meta theory
right,
trap that,
right,
you see with like the Marxists and so many others who just think that their theory literally just explains the Big Bang and
right,
everything
right,
proceeded from it. But man, like it is Girard's theory, one of the reasons it's so powerful and it has such an effect on people when they really kind of get it is, well, it's hard to find examples of, human behavior, human events where you can't pull at least some insight using, the Girardian framework. And
right,
it's useful for almost everything. And so it's very tempting to think it's universal and it, in
right.
some way, because some ways it is.
Well, to the extent, here's the thing I would say, to the extent that it is that aspects of it are universal, it's to the extent that they are just merely using language that's more Western rationalist mind friendly to explain what is already kind of apparent in the biblical text, right? In a way that it just hits you, already hits you and convicts you. He's just putting words to it that I guess the modern rationalist kind of educated Westerner can actually receive on a different wavelength than maybe they couldn't see it quite as clearly in the language of the traditional theological approaches to the biblical text. When you add an anthropological layer to it, you're like, well, that makes sense. Anthropology is such a young discipline, and compared to like something like theology, and it's often considered kind of liberal or totally whack by a lot of folks who would be most interested in taking the Bible seriously. So it's a kind of a ugly duckling from the beginning to try to say there's an anthropology of the Bible. It's like, what do you got up your sleeve with that kind of loaded language? But at the same time, it is using, Rene does use language that again is just a little bit more for the 20th century type mind that he's in, to be able to explain things in a way that I guess can allow people to hear it. So in that sense, mimetic theory, although he didn't develop it as such, acts and functions as a kind of apologetic, um, almost for the
I
modern.
I think he I think he had an idea that somewhat. I
I think he
mean,
did too, but he tried to
yeah,
play it both ways on that
yeah.
because he always
He
wanted
was
to,
conscious of his audience for sure.
yeah, he always wanted to kind of go back both ways. But I'm not doing this to defend, like he was. Am I doing this as an apologetic for the biblical faith, or am I just merely doing science and happen to just stumble on the biblical revelation
Yeah,
at?
I mean, the interesting thing is like the anthropological theory is fascinating, but what I find too is, this is sort of how I open the door to conversations with religious people on the topic who might be a little wary of, they hear anthropologists and they think Margaret Mead or something. And it's that even if you just want to come at this from a literary standpoint, take the Northrop Frye kind of literary critique model and think of the Bible, even though it wasn't written this way, it's how it's come down to us as, it's an entire contained universe. It's the whole, you have to look at the whole thing as one and not just as parts, and take the reality that it sets before you as its preconditions for granted. You have to put yourself into that world and be willing to act in it according to its own rules. And so if you take it like that and just read it that way and forget about the anthropology, once Girard points out to you the things that he points out about the biblical text, I mean, it's so obvious,
Right.
and it's not obvious that like it's here and there. It's obvious that, like this is the right at the core of like what's happening here.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
yeah.
yeah, even that example of him explaining like the Peter's denial sequence, right, where Peter goes through this process of uh, joining the people around the fire as Jesus is being persecuted on trial, right? And it's a cold night, and there's all these people gathered around to see what's going to happen next. And it says the text says Peter goes to join them near the fire, and Rene points out because he's a good literary thinker And he's like, well, fire is like this primordial place in which culture is
Mm,
transmitted and revivified and reinforced, and the dances that go around the fire, that primitive sacred is so connected to this idea of fire. And it's fitting that it's around this fire that this crowd that is meaning to persecute Jesus in a blind zeal, Peter wants to be next to them, and they tempt him. They're challenging, hey, you have that redneck accent. Do you know this guy?
mhm,
Are you one of him? Are you a freak? I smell that you're not speaking the way we're supposed to speak around here. You're not liking the icons of history that we're supposed to like around here, Peter. What are you doing? You're looking a little funny here. There's so much meaning in that. Of course, that's not what literally is said, but that's just, when you learn to look at life as art, and then you look at the biblical text artfully displaying that life as art reality that
mm.
we're in, that's what Rene invites us to be more bold in looking at the text like that, instead of looking at it as some kind of this dead kind of like a, I don't know, recipe or something, that has no life and vitality to it. And he says that that's the great temptation that we're all facing, that Peter stands in for, is this invitation to denounce your friends when they are being persecuted, when they're being isolated, because we hate the concept, we hate the experience of social death, right? And that's what Peter is facing, the potential for social death. And Rene puts so much emphasis on the details in that exegesis he does, where he's looking at, oh, it's a young lady, so it's a girl, he wants to impress her. Oh, I don't know this man, I don't know what you're talking about. And there's a seductiveness to the desire to kind of fit in and pull your punches, and there's wisdom in that on some level, that we all have to be wise as serpents and gentle as a dove, like Jesus says. But at the same time, that wasn't the way Peter was supposed to do it. That's not what it looks like, Peter. And that's what we all are supposed to see ourselves as, Peter, in that moment, not willing to stand with the vulnerable or the person being excoriated, like Christ was, right? That.
Yeah, Girard points out that people often personalize that story as if it has something just to do with Peter himself, if it's just a character building scene for the apostle Peter. But he points out correctly that Peter was supposed, I mean, he was the boldest of all the disciples. I mean, maybe we don't hear much about him. Maybe Simon the Zealot was up there too, but we don't hear much about that. But Peter was the one who drew his sword on the temple guards the night before. Like, this is a guy who is not afraid to face physical danger, at least, to stand by his friend. He was willing to risk deadly combat, the night before. Uh, and so he wasn't scared in that sense. And yet somebody that strong, Peter the Rock, crumbles when, a girl of his tribe, or somebody, just his own peers, his social environment, puts even the slightest pressure on him, and he breaks. And I think that, you know, a lot, like sort of the fundamentalist view of the Bible that is prevalent even in like non technically fundamentalist factions a lot today, is to take this idea that the Bible, what the Bible, like the things specifically that the Bible says that are in the words, like that's all the Bible's trying to tell us. And you're stepping into dangerous ground if you know if you not extrapolate, but if you start talking about the cultural and social context of something in order to like flesh out what's happening, right? So if like the example you're giving right now, if instead of just taking it as there was this guy Peter and he denied Christ, and there were these other 10 disciples who all got scared when he was being crucified, and sort of ran off and hid themselves, and you think, okay, like that's, if this was a novel, like you could kind of see that happening. But when you take all the entire thing into account, and you have a man being set upon by a mob, being abandoned by his friends and everybody who knows him other than a couple women. And when you take into account that this is the Son of God on earth, and that the experience he came to share with us was the experience of abandonment, mockery, suffering, and violent death. That he came in that form and submitted to that in order to, I have my own theory on this. I fight with people about it all the time, but I mean, I don't know how you get around it. Like, to me, you ask, like, are there any limitations to God's power, right, or his scope? And I think the answer is that his the limits of his power and vastness uh, are when they run up against just straight logical contradiction, right? So when you start talking about whether he can create a stone so big that he can't lift it or something, you're just talking about a sort of logical contradiction. And if you think of God as a complete being, as the one universal whole that is to which nothing can be added, and whose power is infinite to the point that a thought forming in his being is instantaneous with that event occurring in the universe. Like, there's no space between his own thoughts and their manifestation. Like, just infinite power moving through reality with no resistance. That there are certain limitations. There are certain things that God, that omniscient God doesn't know, for example, at least not in this, not really. And I argue with people about this, but I think about, like, the when he would punish the Israelites out in the Sinai desert because they were complaining about starving, and him getting so angry at their ingratitude and punishing them, killing them for it. And thinking about the fact that God, at that point at least, he didn't know what it was like to watch your child starve to death. How could he? God can't suffer. God, if he's a perfect, all-powerful, all-everything being, suffering is one thing that nobody and nothing can make him do. Anything that might grieve him has a universal context that he can place it in, that creatures in time can't. Nothing can physically harm him, nothing can threaten him or make him afraid or make him feel just any of those things. And so the idea that he would know what it's like for a mother to watch her child starve to death and be as unsympathetic with that feeling as to kill her and her whole family if they complain about the food situation in Sinai. Like, it's a hard way to read the Old Testament, but it's the way I read it, and it introduces this element to the crucifixion and just the incarnation in general, that and this is where people really where a lot of my fellow Christians have a real hard time with this one, is that I think God coming to earth and choosing the particular mode that he did in coming to earth was God making amends to us as much as it was a means of healing, the divide that was caused on our part by the fall. It was, I think there's an element of him saying, like, that like a realization of what it was that we had been going through down here all this time, and how for creatures that are not infinite and have extreme limitations and short lives, that this world that we've been thrown into was difficult and painful in ways that he, as an omniscient and omnipotent being, couldn't really grasp because he hadn't experienced it. And I think that over the course of the Old Testament, through his relationship to humanity, his own personality kind of developed to a degree where he began to understand that there was, maybe more to people, more to a mother complaining about her starving child than just her being, a pain in the ass or something. Like, started to understand that these people are going through something down here. And when he realized what that was, when he started to really understand that, he he had to tell us, that it can't be any other way, because um, in order for the world for life to exist, life in time means change. And for us, change most often means suffering of some kind, very often at least, and in the end, definitely at least. But if there was no change, then nothing would evolve, nothing would grow. You couldn't have just anything. Everything would be frozen into stone, and we wouldn't have life. We wouldn't exist. And so he had to come down and tell us, like, I can't change the nature of the universe. Even I can't, because it would just be, it's a logical contradiction. I can't create a dead universe and then have it be living. It's just a contradiction. And so it has to be this way in order for you to exist and us to even be having this conversation right now. What I can do is I can come down and show you that I know what it's like to be mocked and spit on and beaten and tortured, abandoned by my friends, and even what it's like to feel abandoned by God. And I can come have that experience with you, and we can go through this together. And I can sort of make amends for my responsibility in creating this universe in a way that, that does have so much suffering, at least on one end of it. And, so people get very uncomfortable with the idea that God is making amends to man. But they think it diminishes him somehow. I kind of look at it as the exact opposite. I look at it as like it's the grandest gesture that is really imaginable. A being that needs nothing, that has no limitations on his own scope and power, and just he could do anything other than come down to earth and be mocked and spit on and tortured and killed. But that's what he chose to do, because he wanted to come down and do that with us. And I think it's beautiful,
Yeah, so you think that are you suggesting that God changed his mind after he saw creatures through history, or that maybe the text just got a little bit
Uh,
more
well, I
different?
think, and again, so here, like, I always come at this stuff from a literary perspective, just because
Yeah.
um, I think if you could start getting into the different sources for the Old Testament and when this was written and when these edits and redactions happen, and that's all. I like reading about that stuff, and it's important. But the way it came down to us, right? By the time of Christ, the Old Testament was set in stone, and then by the time it came down to us, the whole Bible had been the same for a long time. So it is what it is, and I take it as a whole, right? And the because that's what our theology was born out of. Our theology wasn't born out of, well, this was written in the 3rd century BC, and this was, it wasn't, our theology wasn't born out of that. It was born out of taking it as a whole. So I mean, to me, I think it's clear, if you take the Bible at its word, which I think even a lot of even people who call themselves fundamentalists often don't do this, at least in certain parts. If you just take it at its word, um, I think it's very clear that God's personality develops as time goes on. And you say, well, how could that be possible? And you say, before the creation of the universe, you have just God, right? There's just one entity, and it's all encompassing, all knowing, all powerful, but more or less static, or only internally dynamic. And then it breaks out and creates the universe. But for some time, the universe operates entirely according to the laws of his mind, right? The entire thing is really just a physical extension of the laws of his mind, so that physics, chemistry, all those basic sciences that defined everything from the Big Bang to the creation of life, that there's no space between the structure of God's mind and the universe that's being manifested, right? And so, still, there's not a lot of room for reflection there. There's not a lot of room for God to think about himself, for example. Like, I mean, Carl Jung points this out. Like, in order to have a concept of yourself, Jung says that requires resistance of some kind. Because if you're just literally, if you imagine you are literally all powerful,
Yeah.
so there's a brick wall in front of you. It doesn't mean you can run through it. It means you can walk through it like it's not there. You are infinitely powerful, infinitely everything. Then you move through, you create the whole universe, do whatever it is, but you encounter no resistance at any moment. You think it happens, and that leaves you with very little cause to stop and be thrown back on yourself and have to even consider that, like, oh, I'm actually something separate from this creation around me, or uh, because again, if your thoughts are coincident with events in that creation happening, then it'd be very hard to draw a dividing boundary between you and it, right? So you just have no cause for that. And even when life comes along, the instinctual, the animal world that runs on instinct is still running according to the laws that are inherent in God's mind. The basic structure of his mind is still being played out in that way until you get to human beings. He creates these little creatures, and the strangest thing happens. He starts to pay attention to them and realize that these things are they're awake. They're doing their own thing here. It's as if you were having a dream, and in your dream you realize somehow that there was another person in there, like a real freely acting being in your dream. Like, that would be pretty shocking. And you have these human beings that are not just running according to the laws as they play out, or maybe they're laws that God hadn't been required to become aware of yet by that point, but they have free will. They can disobey him. They can destroy themselves, do terribly self-destructive things for no reason, just anything. And it has to be a choice. And so, of course, like, naturally, that what else could God possibly be interested in more than these creatures, right? The thing that he can actually have a relationship with, because it's very clearly not him. It's hard to say that a rock is not him, and uh a fish and a deer are not him. They're all operating according to basic laws, sort of repetitively, and very easy to make them synonymous with the being of God. But with man, you couldn't really do that. You had a creature that, the people who he chose for his great task, was, Israel means the people who struggle against God. And it's like, that's very strange.
Yeah.
The thing that he values then about human beings is that we push back against him, we struggle against him. It's another way of saying that we have the ability to reject him. And it's only when you have the ability to reject and say no that genuine relationship is possible. And so, otherwise you just have if God just wanted worship, he could just get it from the angels. Man, he can have a relationship. He can, it's just like another one of those logical contradictions where you can't force somebody, no matter how powerful you are. You could be all everything, you could be able to blink the universe into existence. You cannot force somebody to love you, because if you force them, it's not love, and you have to receive it freely. Otherwise, it's just not meaningful. And so it put God in this situation where the only other creature in creation that was worth having or possible to have a relationship with, was one that, due to circumstances on the earth that we all live on, uh, constantly rejected him. And a lot of the Old Testament is him throwing these just psychotic fits at the idea of being rejected. As you said, a lot of it's in like um, the language of an ancient honor culture. A husband with a betrayed wife that he's gonna humiliate and stone now with the rest of the community because she's whored around with other. And it's like a lot of that language where he feels so betrayed and so angry and so outraged. And he punishes the Israelites so much, and uh, and then as time goes on, and this is another thing I take from Jung, I do think, like, I do look at the book of Job as kind of the real turning point in this relationship between God and mankind. Is Job, which is the last, if you go according to the order of the books in the Hebrew Bible, as opposed to the way they were rearranged in most of our Bibles. Job's vision at the end, when God takes him up into the whirlwind, that's actually the last time God speaks in the Bible. After that, there's some prophets that speak for him there, and then you have your kind of historical books like Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's it. And so that's his last direct message to human beings is that that temper tantrum he throws at Job toward the end, unless you're a Christian. Then the next time he speaks is, "This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased." When Christ is baptized, those are the next words that come from God to mankind directly. And so it really kind of frames it like that. Okay, wait a second. You had this Job incident where, again, if you take it at face value, it's funny how many people, when they Job is another subject I often argue with my Christian friends about. But it's funny how many people, when they try to defend the orthodox views of the book of Job, end up making the same arguments Job's friends made that were rejected by Job and eventually by God, Like you'll say, for example, that at the beginning of the book, it tells you that this man Job is upright and blameless. And they'll
Yeah.
say, well, he wasn't without sin because that's not possible. Therefore, you can't say that he's blameless and totally innocent and undeserving of things that came, because he can't be sinless. And I look at it and I say, now hang on, like, yeah, granted, it is impossible, but this is a story that they're sending, that they're telling
Yeah.
us. And they're saying, for the purposes of this story, this man is blameless. In other words, he's
Right.
done nothing to bring anything on himself. And again, that's the starting point that they're asking you to go with them on for the story. And you start out with that, and then you see what happens to Job, and you see his friends come out and give the traditional responses, that you must have done something, or your family who got killed, like surely they displeased God somehow, or there's some greater purpose, whatever it is, that there's some justice and logic to this whole thing. It's not just random. It's not just God sort of being, hoodwinked by Satan into torturing his best servant on earth for no reason. It's just something in there that you've done to bring this on you, or what, because otherwise just God would not allow it to happen.
Right.
And Job says no, of course, and no, and no, and no. And you get up to the very end, and God kind of overpowers him, but uh, never really counters any of the arguments that Job had brought against God. He just sort of overpowers him, but then says to Job's friends that I'm upset with you because you've not spoken truly of me as my servant Job has. And so if you go back then and read all of Job's diatribes, and then take that as God saying, oh yeah, he was right about that, then there's a certain level of self-awareness there. I mean, that maybe wasn't present before, where you have like a harsh critic of God's justice in that book that he now is looking at. Instead of wanting to smite that person or anything else, he's recognizing that Job had a point, and telling his friends that. And so then the next time he speaks is when his son comes to earth and he anoints him. And so I see like a development in God's understanding of himself, say, or in the breadth of his own experience, and a greater familiarity with the variety and the depth of experience that humans have here on earth, that he couldn't have possibly had at the beginning, that
Yeah.
through his relationship to us, he developed. And then once it kind of clicked, that was sort of the catalyst for him, going from the God of wrath to the God of mercy that we have in the New Testament.
Interesting. Yeah.
So,
Have you read Rene Girard's book on Job?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
I think I've read all of Girard's stuff.
Did
I'm a
you mean,
fanatic.
did you mean, you mentioned Jung? Were you talking about Jung, or did you said Jung at one point? And I
Yeah,
didn't,
Carl Jung, yeah.
he talks about Job like this too?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's got a book called Answer to Job, and
Okay.
what he means by that is that Christ was sort of the
Yeah.
answer to the experience with Job. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting because Girard and Jung have some correlations there that, Girard didn't like Jung, and the psychologists like Freud, but there was some overlap there with them, and that idea that you read the language. I mean, in his book, he talks about the passages about treading that ancient path. The ancient path is a language that the so-called friends of Job use, which is like a connotation to the ancient path of sacrificing the king. And Job is probably like a king figure or like a nobleman
Something
who's,
like that. Yeah.
yeah, and he's got this group of his court wants to kill him, wants to lynch him, but they need
And
him
a
to come in.
Gentile, by the way, which is very interesting
Yeah,
in the
that's a
context
good
of the
point.
Old Testament.
Yeah, and he gets kind of cornered in this point where they need him to say he's guilty for them to go ahead and sacrifice him. And
Right.
it's amazing how people's false sense of God, which is so derived, I would say, in the kind of pagan mythological framework that we need that. And I'm gonna challenge your narrative a little bit, but I think it's very similar. But we need, let's face it, man, humans need to project that kind of view of God, that hard to get view of God, that God's hard to get, so to speak. We have to construct that view of God in order for us to be attracted to his way. And that's
Mm,
because we want him to be in our image the way our terms are set, not his
yeah.
terms. And
Yeah.
so we don't want the the unconditionally loving. And Rene has a quote that fits this since we're talking about him, where he says basically that God died for us and we could hardly care less. Meanwhile, as soon as a supermodel walks by, we are transfixed and hoping that they'll gaze at us. And
Yeah.
we're so desirous of that which seems to be hard to get that we have no desire to respect and value that which is unconditionally available, like God's love. And so it's almost like God has given us a grace through history to malign his character and the way we speak about him. He's, through his mercy, allowed that kind of flawed framework about him as a means to allow people to get on board with following his way of the abundant life that the kingdom of heaven represents, right? So it's like he affords us that kind of he allows us to indulge ourselves in putting a little bit more pagan juju onto him than is actually there, right? And we need that to find him attractive enough to obey him, because we want those kind of dictatorial leaders in our own life.
Mm.
And so we make of him in that same way. We make him in the same image of the same strong man figure that we all want in various ways, whether it's in a political sense or, again, if it's the hard to get girl that everybody wants, or it's the hard to get guy everybody wants, or it's the hard to get, aloof, above the fray, tough, hard to please, hard to get love from. Those things seem to seduce us in life, those mimetic obstacles, and we are drawn to them magnetically. And God kind of permits us to do that same aligning of his character, if that's the means by which we can get our act together to some degree, right? I think that's what he's doing there. That's always what I've always thought.
Christopher Lasch, in his book Culture and Narcissism, has this one passage where he talks about how uh, children who are raised by just extremely permissive parents, um, it's a well-known thing, like anecdotally in our own lives, but then he said this is really backed by a lot of study, that parents who are just extremely permissive and non-punitive and just you know that they more often invite contempt and resentment from their children than they do gratitude for their permissiveness.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, there's maybe a certain level of that too. If like we just can't handle the open hand, and I mean, I think though, a way around that, that's still satisfying to somebody like me who really struggles with, a lot of the portrayals of God in the Old Testament. And I think we are called on to struggle with those things, it doesn't mean you adopt some Marcionite heresy or something, but I think that you know God calls on us uh, to construct our minds in such a way that you are not going to be able to read Ezekiel or Jeremiah or the book of Job without flinching. We're
Yeah.
supposed to flinch when we see that. Otherwise, you're missing something, I think. And it should
Yeah.
be something we have to struggle with. Even if the answer you eventually land on is, it's not murder when God does it or whatever. You can land on whatever answer you want, but I think we're called on to struggle with it at least.
Yeah.
And a way to sort of to do what you're saying, to make God into this dictator that is not that permissive parent that we have contempt for, but is a dictator that's powerful, who we can and have to respect, and that is actually hard to get despite being always available. Is you say, well, he is a dictator. He's claiming the right to tell us to love our enemies. I mean, think about that. Like that is like a total claim on your person to tell
Yeah.
you you have to love your enemies, right? It's
Yeah.
like just a basic violation of how we approach social life and the world in general. And
But
so if he
he
has,
doesn't.
yeah,
Well, go ahead.
or just if he's claiming that power, he's claiming the right to tell us to be able to do that, to tell us
Yeah.
that it's our responsibility if we see somebody being set upon by a mob to stand with that person and
Yeah.
accept martyrdom with them if that's what it comes to. He's claiming those are total claims on who we
Yeah.
are as people, and that is like a dictatorial mindset and claim. It's just in a different direction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a perfected mindset. That, but he doesn't tell us, he doesn't tell us that when he says love your enemies, it's not necessarily saying you have to have an emotional feeling that is loving feeling, and a lot of people, I think, assume, man, that's ridiculous. I don't feel love towards my enemy. And you're asking me to feel love. And it's like, well, it's because you have a modern or something, some kind of different notion of love than I think what's going on there. I think love in that context of your enemies may actually invite you to lay down your life for your enemy at some point, but it more often on a daily basis means having a disposition of peace towards your enemy with a radical level of empathy, even if it's strategic empathy for the sake of stopping reciprocal violence. And I think a lot of those admonitions in the biblical text, especially in the gospels, are basically a survival guide of once Christ dissolves the scapegoat mechanism's illusion on the cross and says it's finished, you have to go back to the prior portion of his ministry and look at everything he's telling you as a survival kit for
Hmm.
how you're going to create functioning societies in lieu of a scapegoat that everybody believes is guilty. It's literally like a practical, so it's not a kind of sentimentalism. It's almost like a pragmatic, you got to do it because the only
Yeah.
way you're going to make it, like literally as a species, is to practice these principles like turning the other cheek, do not resist evil with violence. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. God makes the rain fall on the just and the unjust. These are principles of sense making and perception of reality that are going to be absolutely vital for any kind of civilization to function after the bumpers, as I call them, for bowling. Scapegoating mechanism is kind of like the bumpers of history, right? You can't really, you're safe. You're playing on a kid's level. And then when Christ destroys the scapegoat mechanism, and then from there on, we start to have a suspicion of a hermeneutic of suspicion towards any kind of myth or founding myth or maintaining myth of society. Anytime we try to resurrect a new myth, we're always going to have a sensibility ever more aggressively through history of being suspicious of it and therefore not being able to maintain that unanimity of belief that the person is guilty, and therefore not being able to preserve or revivify culture, right? And that goes back to like Peter at the fire, he's not able, fire represents that primordial ability to warm ourselves together in that kind of cathartic union of being together in the belief that this person is good and that person is deserving of all damnation and hell. And Jesus dissolves that, and he puts us in this psychologically fraught state if we try to persist and doing things other than the way he said, like loving your enemy. Loving your enemy is a disposition of shalom. It's not, it's not this sentimental feeling, you know what I mean? I don't think it's meant to be.
Sure.
I've got to really work myself up into a frothing feeling of fuzzy feelings for this horrible person who's assaulted my
Of
father.
course, yeah.
Like, no, it's not like that, you know.
Is that it disarms you against evil, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
not that either. It's
yeah,
just it's telling you that um, a murderer might go to the electric chair, but you don't, no matter what they did, you don't pull that lever to the chair with joy in your heart.
yeah,
You understand that at some point this human being was an innocent 3-year-old who had his whole life in front of him,
yeah,
and through his experience with the world, not to relieve him of any responsibility. I'm not saying it's like just pure environmental thing, but the fact of the
yeah,
matter is you took that human material, that 3-year-old, and pushed him through a particular set of life circumstances, and the world's tough, man. And that's how he ended up. He ended up as a terrible person who's in the electric chair. And, understanding that that it's a matter of grace and luck and a little bit of your own will,
yeah,
but only a little, that you're not in his spot and he's not pulling the lever, and just understanding that and being grateful for it, but then pulling the lever because that's the law and that's what we do to people who did what he did and whatever. But that's important. That's an important distinction.
yeah.
um I think that oh gosh, I was just gonna say, are you talking about Peter? Oh, the it is an instruction guide for survival, but it's also a, because if you think about, like, Jesus sent his apostles out, and then as the church grew, like, all Christians are to be sort of deputized into this role that mimetic contagion, mimetic energy bounces around from person to person and group to group in a society, and it escalates as it goes. And the idea is we're going to grow this movement, we're going to grow this church, and eventually there's going to be enough of us that when that mimetic contagion bounces around the society and it lands on one of us, that particular strand of contagion dies there. That you are not going to, you're not going to return fire, and that thing that's been bouncing around, it's going to stop with you
Yeah,
and with your group, say, even. And and for the early church, I mean, well, so the other, sort of a corollary of that is energized toward a scapegoat figure. We're going to grow this movement, grow this church until there's enough of us around that one of us is going to be there, and at least around, and we're going to break up the unanimity of that mob. We're going to go stand with that person. If they want to kill him, they'll have to kill both of us, and then reckon with that themselves and see how that affects their attempt to use this person as a scapegoat when they have to bring in somebody else as part of it, and like that you throw a wrench into that process. And in their case, that meant martyrdom. But it's this idea that, you're the pattern interrupters. You go out and this energy bounces around. When it gets to you, though, you break up the unanimity of the mob,
yeah,
and you end any mimetic hostility that bounces your direction. You end it there. And so instead of being a mirror, you just absorb the energy.
yeah,
And that if we get enough people like that, then who are willing to do that and willing to take it, then eventually we'll wake everybody up, and out, at least outnumber the people who don't want to be awakened. And you see it today, how it's very interesting. Obviously, you look at communist China or something, and they're certainly not Christians, and yet, like, on the international stage at least, and I can't speak to this so much, like, 'cause I don't I don't know Chinese domestic politics well, but I would bet to a degree, even internally, their values have been colonized by this message of Christ, where they still have
Right.
to
Yeah.
frame their actions, say at least in the international
Yeah.
realm, so they have to frame it in terms of
Because
that would have grown out of our common belief here.
because that's why you can't, that's why Jesus tells Paul, it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. This concept that Paul relates in his conversion experience is this image of an ox that's hitched to a wagon, and you can kick and kick and
Hmm.
kick the pricks, but it's not going to get you off of the goads that have you. And this is something that I think is needs to be talked about more. And I'm so glad that you introduced this to Tucker. And I want, just like, look, a couple things. There's a few things that I've been kind of been like a lone guy out there talking about every day for years on broadcast radio and podcasts, and everybody that would have me on their show. I've been talking about the seed oil thing and relating that, and the Rene Girard thing. And I'm really happy where the seed oil thing is. I want to get that Rene Girard thing where the seed oil thing is. You know what I mean? I want to get that into the zeitgeist more faster. So
Yeah,
hopefully you and a few others who are able to really not just, it's not about getting the gimmick name. It's about getting people to the truth of what's happening in history. It's so important.
yeah,
This
and
is
it's
not
I
an
think in our
armchair theory. This is like life or death stuff that we need to wake up to, because we
in
can do history the easy way or the hard way, depending on how we want to relate to this. Like,
in our day too, I find that Girard is, because I mean there's a certain heritage that we've been deprived of, right? In the sense that if you were a peasant in a medieval French village and that's the life you were born into, and you're never going to travel more than 15 miles from your place of birth, um, they were capable of an uncritical uh, absorption of their Christian faith that we today in the modern, more critical world with the different strands of information, even different strands of Christianity kind of bouncing around in our heads, we just don't have the ability to be like uncritical children in that sense. Like it's something we have to find another way to be able to relate to the story in the face of competing narratives and all these other things. And I find that for people who, this is Tucker and I have been talking about Girard since that happened, like via text message and
good.
phone, and he's interested in it because I've been kind of pushing it on him. Because Tucker, his family was Episcopalian, which he always says like that's like the least Christian you can possibly be with, and
Right.
still call yourself say I'm a Christian. It's like being an Episcopalian. That's what he says.
Right.
And he's not somebody who, he hasn't spent the last several decades like thinking of, doesn't go to church or thinking in terms of Christianity in his everyday life or anything, but he started to wake up to how important it is.
Yeah.
But for somebody like him who's lived that life, you have to be able to give them a framework that's going to allow them to come back. And Girard is that for so many people. I mean, it was
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
for me, like in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. I never like let it go, but really just injected
Yeah.
life into it after, I had lost the life that it had when I was a child.
Well, think about this, and think about, and I want to go back to what you said about China, because I think there's such an important point here that, like, the ways in which these countries like China have had to conform to the Western dominated world order, in the way, whether they had to by force or they had to by point of competition, mimetically trying to compete and be
Yeah.
like the wearing of suit ties that the Chinese president and other, all the little things, everything about it, the way they speak about things, the way they talk about their humanitarian problems and their things, and how
Yeah.
they address all this stuff. To me, it is so telling that this is it's hard to kick against the pricks, because it's like you can't escape it, because the let's and a quick way to put this, the gospel is like this super nuclear power. Before we get into what it means about the afterlife, it's this super nuclear power that whatever cultures have it and are bathed in it the longest without any interruption of being conquered and having it eliminated or something, or ethnically cleansed, but if they're able to saturate in the biblical language and the storytelling and everything around the biblical experience and the gospels, the more they are able to saturate on it, the more it infects them, and it does give them an advantage technologically, because to the extent that you're able to demystify from your pagan sacred myths, including faith and nations and faith and all these things, and kind of faith and hierarchical pecking orders of expertise. That's another way of looking at it in modern context. The more you're able to kind of look past that and actually investigate the world for objective truth to help your fellow human being, like scientific endeavors with a Christian inflection will do, the more you're able to have an advantage technologically compared to other countries, which will give you an advantage to have, again, using that for more worldly purposes, have more political power and control relative to rivals. Now, of course, it burns out the nations that use that advantage, like we're seeing right now in the West, where we're being haunted by wokeism and all this insanity, weaponized resentment and envy, which is nothing but this kind of perverse, mutated, cheap ripoff of Christianity with violence. And that's what the left represents. But at the same time, it's also infecting these more less Christianized nations like China, because again, they want to imitate the advantage that a gospel haunted society has. So it's like a app, it's like a worm on a hook, right? They go for the worm. Oh, the gospel hooks them, because now the sense making that's underneath that, or use it as sweet apple, whatever metaphor you want to use, they're going for the fruit of, oh, look, they have more wealth and power. They've got the Hollywood, they've got the military, they've got all this currency domination. We need to be like that. So we're going to imitate that. And we're going to imitate their music, imitate their movie making, imitate everything. And then while they're imitating the crass liberalism, there's still enough Christianity infection in that liberal petri dish that they're getting the Christian sensibilities, zapped into them. And over time, they're going to be completely haunted by the gospel too. So that's how the gospel is taking over the world.
Yeah. I was, I was talking to a friend of mine, Noam Dworman, recently, who he owns the Comedy Cellar in New York, but he's Jewish, if you couldn't tell by his name, and he's very Zionist, very pro-Israel. And he and I kind of became friends because we go to war on that issue all the time, but we are able to, do it in a way that we've just sort of developed a rapport and learn to respect the other person through our ability to disagree about something we both feel so strongly about. And so he's like very much on that side. And when I was talking to him recently, I brought this up and kind of expected him to balk at it, but he didn't. He actually confirmed it 100% with his own experience, and affirmed what I was saying. Is that I think that one of the big disconnects when Americans and just the Western world in general are looking over at what's going on between Israel and its enemies is we have this Christian idea that, forgiveness is a good thing, at least just in a vacuum. Forgiveness is a good thing, and conflict de-escalation is sort of always the default that we should be aiming toward, and so forth. We have all these basic ideas in our head, and when you listen to like religious Jewish Zionists here in the United States, people like Ben Shapiro or Dennis Prager, say, that when you listen to them, what you actually hear is they're really just Christians in terms of their value system. They've grown up in America, lived in America, and they've absorbed Christian values. When you go talk to Israelis and Muslims in the Middle East, what you find is like they don't have the same conception of those things. The idea of forgiveness. And there are a lot of Jews who have written about this over the years, that retaliation, that you avoid, like one way that one rabbi put it that I was reading is that the Jewish principle is to avoid conflict almost at all costs, but when you're down to that last penny that you can pay, then the principle shifts to retaliation and victory, and that's it. And that's not, again, it's not a Christian concept. The idea that that retaliation, revenge is like a base, like revenge is something that is not, it's just simply not approved really for us, you know. Even in the Old Testament, God said his vengeance is mine, but you know, for Christians, it's really just not something you're permitted to do. You don't take that liberty. And it's hard, so it gets hard for people to understand really what's going on over there. And they you know, they'll see certain things happen in Gaza, and they'll tell themselves stories about what must have gone into that decision, or it was a mistake or whatever, just because we would never do that. You know, we had like Abu Ghraib, and when that got publicized, like that was a major turning point in the Iraq war. Like, and you know, while all that stuff was terrible, what was going on there, especially a lot of the stuff the CIA was doing that was not in the news reports prominently, but it was terrible. But it wasn't like Saddam Hussein's torture chambers with you know, wasps' nests and power saws or anything like that. It was relatively mild in the grand scheme of things, but even that, it scandalized us so much that, you know, it really was a major turning point, making us think about like, what are we doing here? And what is this war doing to us, let alone what we're doing to them? Major turning point. And you look in Gaza, and I mean, there's been, just because cell phone video and everything else is so much more prominent now. I mean, you go on certain Telegram channels and there's an Abu Ghraib incident times 10 every single day that the Israelis are committing over there without having any of that same reaction to it that a relatively minor version like Abu Ghraib had on us. And that's really hard for, I think, people who grow up in a Christian values environment to understand. And so we try to make it fit into our framework and tell ourselves that, you know, or I don't tell myself that, and you probably don't either, but the Christians out there who are strong supporters of Israel have to tell themselves that, well, there must have been, you know, a reason that made the calculation necessary for when they bombed that tent city full of children. You know, there must have been like a critical mass concentration of known enemies. There's something, because we know that people, they wouldn't just bomb that place to terrorize these people and to try to break them down mentally and spiritually and psychologically by terrorizing them like that. That's not, people don't do that. And so it must be something else. But the thing is, you get outside of Christian and Christian influenced societies, and people do that.
Yeah.
And it makes it hard, I think, sometimes for us to really understand some of the things going on around us, especially
But
when
they
it's a
can't do it to the same.
society like Israel that is so familiar to us in a lot of ways, you know, where they wear Western clothes and they build Western buildings and they drive Western cars, and,
Yeah.
you know, they all speak English for the most part.
Yeah.
And so,
But they
like,
still, but they still can't. They're still under the shadow of the cross. Even all those cultures are, you know. You know what I mean?
two varying degrees. Yeah, yeah,
Like they're
right.
still giving them food in Gaza. If this was before the cross, they would just starve them completely and burn them alive. You know what I mean? Like there's
Yeah, maybe you have a kinder view of the situation than I do. I mean, I think that, you know, that more than anything is that they are dependent on and under geopolitical pressure from countries like ours that are under the shadow of the cross.
But that's
I
what
don't
I'm
know.
saying. If you're under the shadow of a cross, you're still under the,
Right.
you know
Okay.
what I
Yeah.
mean? You're
Sure.
functionally still operating under Christ as king. Whether you spit on that or not, it doesn't matter. You're still playing by somebody else's rules.
Yeah.
You
Right.
get what I mean? And that's all that
Yeah.
matters, really. If we're doing real politic,
Well, and as you were
you know
saying
what I
too,
mean?
like
Real
the fish
politics.
hook, you were talking about the fish hook earlier, and there's an element of that to it, right? Because even if they're only doing it because they have to placate the US and the rest of the West,
Right.
and the values that, you know, are important to us, even if they would do it a totally different way, but they have to feed these people because they just have to, you know, there's too much pressure.
Yeah.
The fact that they're doing it is going to start their own, it starts their own people thinking, well, okay, in a situation like this, you have to feed these people. And it sort of starts to become reality, you know. You see
Right.
this in you saw
Right.
this happen the
They're
world.
imitating. Yeah, they're imitating
Yeah.
Christian culture, even if it's not as deeply you know, immersed in them as it might be for, like you said, Ben Shapiro living in a Christian influenced culture here. You know.
Yeah, because
Still
I mean,
there.
at the end of the day, that's like the reason Christianity works, and the reason the scapegoat mechanism was able to be diffused with a single martyrdom, uh, is that there's something very, very basic to humanity going on here, and it's that, you know, you cannot. It doesn't matter who you are unless you, well, I wouldn't. You have to be sort of indoctrinated into a mindset that allows you to avoid this, avoid the fact that, a human being, if they once they know they're scapegoating somebody, they can't do it anymore. It just doesn't have the same force,
Right.
and they lose their motivation for it, and they just can't do it. And it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or atheist or whatever. We're built that way, and
Yeah.
Christians are the people who have sort of adopted that as a primary starting point for their approach to the world. But everybody's built that way. So if you can take that away, take away the ability to just totally separate out this person from the rest of or group from the rest of the community, um, everybody, is going to have the same struggle with it that a lifelong Christian would have.
Right. And that's Christ's influence is to the extent that, you know, there's a lot of political folks in Israel's government that would have loved to do what they've done without having the October 7th thing, but it took the October 7th tragedy to happen, wherein they could get the victim high ground to be able to raise all these buildings and destroy them and destroy so many kids and innocent people with that victim narrative. They couldn't, in other words, again, they're playing under the terms of Christ the King. That's important. They couldn't do that. There's no way they would have to do that if Christ wasn't the king of our moral imperatives around the world. You see what I mean? Because if there wasn't that way, then they wouldn't have to wait for an October 7th tragedy to happen. They just do it, right? Or just, send a nuke without having to wait for a narrative of we've been the victim first. It's always about we're the victim first, which gives us the right to victimize you, and we're only killing you because if it's an accident and you guys are cowards and you hide behind your victims, and we never do that. So we're
And
just
that's the narrative that's the narrative that conceals the scapegoat mechanism
right.
that's actually occurring. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
for sure.
And there's and so that remember that transition that Jesus depicts when he says this temple will be torn down and in 3 days it'll be raised again, right?
Yeah,
That's the transition in history between this ethno-nationalist framework or ethnic, you could call it ethno whatever, but it's this group orientation towards what is sacred. And Jesus says, the new temple will be my body raised up again in 3 days. In other words, the temple that was destroyed in 70 AD was not raised again by God. But Jesus's bodily individual temple was raised in vindication by God 3 days later, as he said. And what that is a transition between the sacred being that of the group and the tribe towards the sacred being found in the human person. And when you have
yes,
ethical transition, there's a higher moral standard that is placed upon you. The yoke is placed upon you, even if you're Netanyahu is. You can't just kill children with impunity and get away with it. That doesn't work anymore. Okay, it might have worked for Caligula. It might have worked for other folks, and you know the names better than I do throughout history. But the more that story is permeating, it's a progressive move, and it's more Christianity is more infected in the world today in 2024 than it was in 2016, and then what it was in 1960, and when it was in 1932, and when it was in 1842 and
yeah,
1649. It's getting more and more infected in the world sense making. Christianity, Jesus, not the church.
yeah.
Jesus is winning history by the scorebook. I know there's a lot of victims. He was one of them, but that's kind of the point of the passion, isn't it? you
I
know?
mean, I think one of the key themes that comes through in the Gospels, as Jesus is interacting with the Jewish religious leaders, and this is another place where, sort of getting the historical context straightened out, is it really enriches the reading of the Gospels and what comes after, where if you go back to the Babylonian exile, for example, to start there, people hear that the Jews, the people of Judea, were deported to Babylon into the exile. And if you ask, like, you're just sort of normie Christian that who goes to church, occasionally, whatever, but knows about that, that event. People kind of take it colloquially as if like every single Israelite or a Jewish person in Judea was moved out to Babylon, and then the Persians came along a little while later, a generation later, and allowed all the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the temple and the city and everything. And that's what brings us into the Second Temple period. When in reality, of course, like if you look at ancient Near Eastern practices and just use kind of common sense, what they did was they took the leadership to Babylon into exile. Anybody who was capable of sort of and given to the possibility of fomenting resistance against Babylon, they were brought out and they were put into exile. But there were a lot of people, most people, 85, 90% of the population, maybe more, who were left behind. These are people in the countryside who are farmers and traders or whatever. They're not political actors or cultural leaders or anything like that. So you have this like the cream of the crop kind of taken away, the vast majority of the people left behind. And while they were in exile, there had always been this strain, and you see these echoes of it in the Old Testament, the pre-exilic literature. There'd always been this strain of like hardcore exclusivist. We're not sticking to the original meaning of the law well enough, and we're going to be punished for it, and just very, very we'd call it xenophobic now with regard to strangers and that was, but it was that was a faction that existed, and we kind of know this because of how many kings they are denounced for immorality and worshiping the wrong gods and stuff, and so it was like a faction that existed. But once they went off into exile, that faction became very powerful. Very similar to like after the Mongols came through the Middle East and Islamic culture just took a hard conservative turn, because how are you going to counter the guy that says we've just been punished by God because I told you we weren't following Muhammad's law closely enough, and this is what happens. And it's hard to argue with that after Genghis Khan comes, and it's hard to argue with that after you have been defeated and your temple burned down and you've been deported to Babylon. And so that faction became very prominent, very powerful. When the Persians came in, they didn't say all of you get on back to Jerusalem where you belong. They said anybody who wants to go back can go back. And most people stayed in Babylon. They'd been there for 70 years. They had lives here. Most of them were born there. Most of them their parents were born there. And so they'd been there a long time. They had interests set up. They had businesses. This is where their lives were. And we know that, if you go to the time of Christ, there were more Jews in Babylon, in that area, than there were in Jerusalem. And so the, large community stayed there and continued to flourish and prosper and live their own kind of separate life over there. And the ones who went back with Ezra and Nehemiah and them, they were like the hardcore religious Israeli settlers who go way out into the West Bank, to settle villages like in the midst of a hostile population. They're hardcore committed, religiously committed people. And it was this faction who was preaching this exclusivist approach to the Israelite religion that went back. And so they go back, and you read Ezra and Nehemiah now, and everybody remembers, the temple being rebuilt and maybe their interactions with, some of the peoples roundabout who don't want the temple rebuilt or whatever. But what most of those two books actually consist of is the leaders coming back and finding that the people they had left behind had gotten to know their neighbors a little too well and had married some of them and had families. And, they'd been there for 70 years with no leadership. So they do what anybody would do. They start to, get to know their neighbors better. And the leaders going around and forcing these people to divorce your wives and abandon your children. This is all annulled. All of this intermixing and this sympathy with and kind of intermarriage with, all that's done. You guys either come back or you're not a part of this story we're telling, about our people anymore. And a lot of them did, a lot of them didn't. The ones that didn't were written out of the story. But then you have this environment, and you see this play out in the Maccabean revolt. You see it play out. I mean, even when you get up into Roman times, where everybody knows well enough that you don't rebel against the Romans unless you really want to invite the wrath of God and all his angels on you. And yet the Jews at the time, like, they were the ones that you couldn't suppress these people, because they were this. I mean, if you go back to the time of Christ and after that, um, you can read ancient texts where Jews in Alexandria, which is the other like giant Jewish population at the time, also had more Jews than Jerusalem did. And from Babylon, and also Jews in the Greek cities and Rome and stuff, they kind of looked at the Jerusalem Jews as like the way that a moderate Lebanese Muslim looks at the Saudis, right? It's like yeah, look, they are the custodians of the holy cities. We respect that. They have a certain role to play. They're kind of crazy, they're a little much for what, we're cool with, but they accept their authority to a degree and everything. But they look at them like they're kind of crazy fundamentalists to a degree. And you see this back then. And so, if you think about, like, in the modern, I think that when you get up to the time of Christ, when he starts getting into these arguments with the religious leaders, what you find is that what was left of the Israelite religion at that point. And what it was we're the chosen people. That's the religion. The religion is we're the chosen people. And any idea of chosen for what task, chosen for what purpose, it kind of like took a secondary role, if even that. The idea became we're the chosen people. The Messiah is going to come and lead us out of exile and victory over our traditional enemies. And so when Christ shows up, the Messiah, one thing he has to do, if he is the Messiah, is he has to end the exile. There's no question about that, however you look at it. And so Christ shows up, and he's there to end the exile. It's not crashing through the Roman wall and making the traditional enemies of the Jews, bow before them and serve them and give them that revenge they're seeking. But it's a sort of backing out of the exile. You come this way, and now there is no distinction between Jew and Gentile. It's another way of ending the exile, but
Yeah.
it violated that sense of specialness and that thing that had really become the all-encompassing point of the religion, which is we're the chosen people. And that makes us special, that puts us on a different plane than everybody else, makes us part of a plan that nobody else is a part of, and all of that. And those people were not prepared to give up that sense of centrality in order to just to end the exile in a way that meant, kneeling before God as children of God with their traditional Greek or Roman or other pagan enemies. And they didn't want they didn't want to lose that sense of specialness, and that's the real reason like Christ was rejected, is he was pushing the lifting of that veil and the crumbling of those barriers between people. And that's something that I think, once the Israelite religion came to an end in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple, so that you no longer have, I mean, it's another thing that is kind of hard, I think, for modern people to conceptualize, because we're so used to decentralized religion. And if, like, we'll see something like Mecca in the Islamic religion and the role it plays, but it's like a symbolic role, kind of, that people face toward it when they pray or whatever. But like, I don't think most people today, we don't have like a full sense of, no, like, the temple in Jerusalem was where God resided on earth, and that is where you brought your sacrifices before him in order to, like, keep the world spinning, basically. It was a very, like, local situation, and with a certain people that it was connected to and all that. And so, like you were talking about, like, at that point, you didn't use this word, but the divine became delocalized, right? Into individual persons, as opposed to a single geographic place and a certain group of people. And uh,
And that comes
in
with
that,
that comes with an ethical reorientation that's going to be worked out slowly in history, right?
yeah, I mean,
I
and
mean,
it
that's the
has been.
difference between, hey, well, this person is my enemy's tribe, so their child's death is not as important as my right to that piece of land that bad guys run or whatever in their narrative. Like, we can't do it like that, If you're
Yeah, and
Christian,
humans are barbarians, so we still do it like that, even Christians, you know. But I think one of the things that like people really
we do
miss.
it, but look, we can't do it like that because it's not real. It's sin is a fantasy. So
Right, right.
that's what I mean by that.
I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of people like they point to wars in Europe after the Christianization of the continent, and they like often attribute that to the religion, and it's always kind of it's just sort of a joke to me, you know, because I mean, it's obvious that what happened was you had a bunch of people who were barbarians who would kill your neighbor's child to take their land, and as long as you won, not feel any particular guilt about it. Um, and those people were Christianized, yeah, sure, but it takes time to take,
Yeah. Yeah.
to take barbarians and turn them into true Christians. It takes time, and what you see is like at the beginning, like it introduced that grain of doubt. It introduced that little
Right.
grain of maybe, wait, is this really what we're supposed to be doing just because it benefits me and my tribe? Like, can I really do this? So it starts out as that grain of doubt, and sometimes a grain's not enough to stop anything,
Right.
but over time, it grows into a mustard tree, let's say, and now, I mean, again, you go to like Abu Ghraib. That's just a perfect example to me because I remember like,
Yeah.
when I was talking to Jocko about it, and when we did our series on his experiences in the Iraq War, and Abu Ghraib happened either right as he was leaving his first tour, or right as he got home. I can't remember which. And I asked him, I was like, you saw this happen, but you're not coming at this as a civilian. You've been in the front lines of the war here, killing people, watching people be killed. You're a student of history when it comes to warfare and atrocities. You know about these things. And in the grand scheme of things, in that sense, what was happening at Abu Ghraib could be looked at as, a relatively minor incident. But when you saw that come across the news, or you saw it come across the internal messaging, what did you think? And it wasn't what he said, but it was really his tone of voice where he said,
Yeah.
I knew that this was not good. Like he knew that this is going to be extremely difficult to maintain support for this war at this point, that the whole mission of what we're trying to do here is compromised now, just everything by that one incident. And that's the thing, like that's when it grows into a mustard tree, is that even when we've kind of stripped the transcendence out of our, not Christian people, but like as a culture and a society in the United States, we've stripped the transcendent side of it away. Um, but still, it's grown into and matured into something that can see it happening uh, in an environment where, look, man, Al Qaeda in Iraq was like on a rampage at that time. They were out there torturing and killing and just butchering people at a just in a way with a certain randomness to it and viciousness that we'd really not been exposed to before, that would have given us an excuse to say this is different, or here's why we don't care what happens to those people or anything. But we didn't. We didn't do that. It had a strong, powerful effect on us. And and again, something relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, because I don't want to trivialize it. What happened there was evil, but again, it wasn't power saws and
Do
car batteries,
I?
yet it had that effect on us,
Yeah.
and that is something you see, like the maturity of that feeling.
I've often had this kind of working, hypothesis or whatever about the way the gospel's infection on our forms of, brutal violence and so forth. The way it kind of operates is often through history, through the change of media technology, right? And there's
Yeah,
always bad things you can say about media technology and how it affects man, but Do you see that working out in a kind of like this weird kind of symbiotic kind of dynamic wherein the Gospels kind of demystify culture, and with that demystification comes technological progress that tends to outpace other cultures that don't have that gospel tradition as long in their uh, cultural memory. And with that advantage comes the ability to not only to have general innovations and technological progress, but also media technology changes and improves, and such that, you know, you look at the Naqba, okay, the kind of media environment that that happened in does not provide nearly the amount of awareness of the victims like we see were going on right now in the conflict today, right? Because we have cell phones and HD videos and internet recordings of
Or
children
even compare
screaming,
it to something more, compare it to the Holocaust. You
right?
know, if we had reams and reams and reams of video and photos of what was going on during the Nakba, of mothers, you know, things we have visual descriptions of, but you know, of uh, when 50,000 people are cast out of a couple cities into the desert with just what they can carry with them, and people are reporting that on the side of the road out in the desert there was a mother who was dead who had been nursing her child, and the child's just sitting there
Yeah,
trying to nurse on a dead breast. Like, you think about things like that. We have all that for the Holocaust. We have like emaciated bodies being thrown into pits and stuff. All these videos that came out that have really been burned into our memory. If
yeah,
we had all that for the Nakba, people would think very, very, very differently
right,
about that whole event. And now the thing is, now with what's going on, like you said, we're in that situation finally, you know.
right. And that's what I'm saying, that there's this weird relationship that the gospel spreads in its effect kind of in relation to the type of media environment, not only the technology and its ability to decentralize information gathering and transmission of data and sounds and HD video and 50 different angles of the same horrific tragedy, and all this stuff has this real world, real time effect of undermining government propaganda of any organization or a country and a cause. That is kind of related to the gospel's ability to get us to look at the victims that we're producing in our kind of our campaigns of mythic grandeur, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's something that you know, one of the reasons it is effective is that once, you know, we kind of touched on this earlier, but it's something that once you're confronted with it, as long as you're of basically sound mind and not operating like deeply indoctrinated into some ideology that counters this, or you're not just a psychotic, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer type or something. If you're just a normal person, like all of us are by definition, um, that this stuff, you have a innate sense for these things. You
Yeah,
know, if you're a kid in school, and I'll bet every single person listening out there, every single one, I'll bet you, remembers times in school where they were watching somebody get bullied and picked on, and they didn't say anything. And maybe they didn't participate, but they didn't say anything. And just that they felt at the time, they knew that that was wrong, and they felt ashamed. And I'll bet you a lot of those people, if they're anything like me, think about those things even as adults now sometimes and still feel shame about it.
yeah,
And that's something that, you know, the fact that that probably is almost a universal experience that tells you that's something basic about our humanity there. You know, and I always
I mean, you said that picture of the baby. What tragedy was that in? The baby trying to suckle the
that
dead.
was during the Nakba,
Yeah,
when you know, 50,000 Palestinians were expelled from the cities of Lydda and Ramleh out into the they were just thrown out into the desert with what they could carry, expelled from the cities by the
and see,
Zionist militia.
yeah.
And they, you know, they died along the path, and eventually most of them made it to Jordan, you know,
And see,
ended up.
I gotta tell you, you know, when that's the difference between ethno-nationalist sense of the sacred versus the personhood sense of the sacred, right? Because again, if you are duped into a type of Christianity that thinks anybody your government tells you to hate is akin to an Amalekite or whatever the heck, then you just put your head down, you close your eyes, you put your hands over your ears, you know, nah, 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 and you just go on to something else. Well, that means you're functionally a pagan. That means you're functionally crucifying Christ on the cross by your actions. You're literally missing the entire point of Christ's work on the cross when you can't look at that and say that should not be happening. This is an injustice. And that's the thing. That's why I always say, we had this discussion last time, Christianity birthed real history, right? Because it's like this calling to tell the truth no
Yeah.
matter what, no matter if it
Yeah.
indicts you and your religion and your dispensationalism and your Darby and your Chuck, whatever, what that guy, John Hagee, no matter if it indicts how many donations you've made to your church over standing for Israel or whatever, you have to tell the truth. And that means taking account for what you do, and when you're using your voice to cheer on, you mean that image you painted, I that's like haunting my mind just now, just hearing about the image, you know?
And you can, look, I have respect for we have this idea because we live in a allegedly representative governmental system, that, we bear responsibility for our government's actions toward, say, Gaza or whatever. And if people think that that's true, and like we have a responsibility to participate in the political process, or at least in practical politics of interpersonal communication in a way that uh, that tries to rein that in, that we have that obligation. That's fine. That's a fine way to look at things. I respect the people who say that, look, this isn't the idea that we have anything to do with what's going on over there. And I don't mean we as Americans, but we as individuals, is really an illusion created by media and propaganda. And really, like, I got friends, I got family, I got neighbors. They have friends, family, and neighbors, and just that right there is way more than enough responsibility to keep me occupied my entire life, and the idea that I'm responsible for what's happening over there. Now the question though is, like, if you are using if you're burning calories to go online and cheer on what's happening over
Right.
there or argue in favor of it or something, that's a different story. But to the people who say that, you're over here, and I hear this a lot, it's a hard thing to argue against. People will say, that we have this idea that we're trying to save the republic, or we're going to rejuvenate America or the West or whatever it is. But what we're really is, you're a blacksmith living, in central Italy, kind of looking at the events that are taking place in the Roman Empire in 380 AD, and thinking, wow, I've got to do something to reverse all this. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
things are happening that are like the very idea that you have anything to do with this is almost, it's very, very you're at least tiptoeing up to the sin of pride closely enough that you better be careful, and it's just sort of a hubristic illusion, and you should focus
Right.
on what's closer to you. I'm very sympathetic to that idea. I don't always, behave in accordance with it, but I
No, but
I
both
I,
can
I
be true.
respect
If
it.
you're if you're cheerleading this type of war behavior or these ideologies, you need to be confronted by what you're cheerleading for any of these conflicts. And if you're not, that's a different story. But I mean, if you got to deal with horrors and tragedies and skulls and murders in your own community, that's its own terror. That is just there's, but that's the point, right? Is when you have an ethical standard of personhood, which we get from Christianity, we don't get to just dismiss things by group status. We dismiss things by, you judge things by what's right and wrong as it accords to the human person, right? Because God has elevated the human person as the new universal temple by which his experience on earth will manifest, right? And so that's a difference between the temple of the second temple there and this new universal temple that Christ inaugurates as the prototype, as the ultimate, example in humankind of how we should treat all humans in that same way. And he does die a death that is unique, but also similar in the sense that, like you said, we do this all the time to one another. And I think we need to be aware of all of its forms and fashions and not romanticize it. Like you said, it's a good point. You don't want to romanticize, well, because it's fashionable to talk about. And that's where, some of the MAGA people criticize some of these left leaning Gazan protesters, because they're over there, protesting the latest thing that their college kids think is cool to protest about.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they don't care about the homeless guy they're stepping over to do that, or all the
Sure.
people that the media doesn't selectively highlight in their media bubbles or whatever. So, but that's the point. That the whole point is the universality of evil, the universality of the fall, and the universality of God's calling to treat the human person as sacred, period, right? That there is no pet.
Individual human person. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
that's
When I was having that conversation with my buddy Noam recently, he asked me about the passage in the Gospels where uh, the Jews and Christ are standing before Pilate, and Pilate's, he's hesitant to carry out the execution that they're asking for. And so, they say, his blood be on us and our children. And
yeah,
he's like, this is kind of crazy. Like, and it's obviously like been the source of a lot of anti-Semitism and problems like throughout history. Like, what do you think about a passage like that? And do you think it's like, because he knows I'm a religious Christian, and so he's like, and do you think that the Jews have like blood guilt essentially, like as a group of people for this? And I said no, because the whole point, or one of the entire points of the Gospels and Christ coming in general, is they don't have the authority to curse their descendants anymore. The idea of generational guilt, like they don't have they can say that all they want. His blood will be on us and our children. They can bring it on themselves if they want to. They can't pass it on to their children. They don't have the authority. Generational guilt is something that was wiped away with the coming of Christ.
right.
And so, because generational guilt is another form of what you're talking about, that group guilt, and if you look at like traditional, and it could be urban societies, whatever, but people who still kind of operate according to the traditional honor mode in the Middle East. You can read this in anthropology books, or just, you can read it in history, or just books about the region, the culture, is the idea that like if I kill David Gornoski's second cousin, and then David Gornoski, who's not directly, he's not that person's brother or something, but you're a second cousin, you kill my cousin. The idea that my innocent cousin over here, that's just a huge injustice. What have you done? That does not exist. That
Right.
what you did in retaliation is a perfectly legal, perfectly reasonable, just, according to the honor code thing to do. I took one of yours, you take one of mine. And nobody would think, how dare he? They'll think, well, now we got to go kill his cousin, but they're not going to think like, how could he do this? And that's the difference between like group and individual respect,
Yeah, yeah, for
And it
sure.
goes to what you're saying about technology too, because it's only when individuals are valued and allowed like the range of expression and the security in their person, their rights, that, and this funnily enough, this is like a variation on Fukuyama's idea of the end of history, um, but that is going to lead to more innovation, cultural and technological, and that the societies that do that are going to become more powerful than those that don't. And just by evolutionary selection and game theory, over time, all societies are going to become more like that. Because if they
Right,
don't, they get subsumed by the ones that don't, or that
right.
do.
And and it has a kind of, for lack of a better word, democratization on even market choices. Like, why should someone have a vision that everybody deserves a personal computer that even the poor can afford, right? Why
Right.
should why should we have a vision that everybody should have a automobile without a horse, so that even the average working man can own a car and go take a trip beyond the borders of their little town, with their family in tow? Why should that be a dream in someone's mind, but for this impetus of the personhood being a person of individual persons being sacred in light of this inauguration of this new universal temple standard in the human person, in the body. All right. And that's this elevation of the body that Christ brings to history. And that's the fight of everything right now is like you got one side which has many different involvements and both parties and so forth. One side has this denigration of the body, whether it's don't breed, don't have children, remove all CO2, which is essential for human flourishing and plant flourishing. You know, this attack on everything that it means to have like the human body be respected and be a part of like creation. There's this uh Russian thinker Vernadsky who talked about the noosphere and this idea that humans are essential for the evolution of the planet into a higher state of existence. This is something that is kind of a derivative of Christianity. This idea that humans are not a plague or a pest on the back of Earth, but rather like this crown jewel that we should
Sure.
celebrate. That's all part of this whole picture here.
The Catholic thinker, Pierre Teilhard Chardin, that's kind of his wheelhouse. He says the same thing. The challenge, and this is the challenge that we've been struggling with now for some time, becomes when the individual is the vessel of the sacred and has the primary claims which we all, whether or you're a religious Christian or a secularized Westerner who's kind of absorbed it through osmosis, we all agree on how to ascribe value and to defend formations that are supra individual.
Yeah.
And so, if the individual is all that matters, well, then anything that inhibits individual self-expression is a bad thing. Anything that puts up boundaries that divide one group of people from another group of people, whether it's a border wall or just cultural differences, that these are things that the grand project should be to do away with these things. And it's we have we've got even you see this like you said with the woke left-wing stuff, that basically what that is just Christianity with all the transcendence stripped away.
Yeah.
It's love your enemy and turn the other cheek, and that's it. Like that's without any, and so that doesn't leave you with anything like understanding that the nations are spoken of in the Bible as things with, if not ontological reality, they have spiritual reality. And they're worth protecting. They're worth defending. There should be peoples. There should be nations. And if for no other reason than just as allowing individuals to flourish in a society leads to more creativity and innovation and so forth, having different cultures like in the world and different peoples sort of living out their own destiny has the same effect on mankind. And so, our challenge is look, and this is another one of those things that I think it better be a challenge for you in the sense that it should not be easy for a Christian, somebody who claims to be a Christian in America, to say that we should have a policy that means that poor family with 3 kids that's, fleeing Honduras or whatever, and is here asking, can we take up residence with you? You're going to support a policy that says, no, that family cannot come here. That better not be easy. It just shouldn't be. It should not be easy. It doesn't mean you don't do it. But you do it with a heavy heart and with a very, you talk about fearing God. Carrying with you the idea that like you better be right, and you bet you that you're pushing up against the limits of what we're allowed in terms of marginalizing the suffering of your fellow human beings, right? And in order to be able to do that, if you don't have something here collective that you're trying to preserve and that you think it's spiritually important to preserve, you just have a political system and a financial apparatus and military apparatus that we call the United States of America, and then 330 million people who happen to live here under that thing's authority, and it's just individuals, then it becomes very difficult. I mean, how do you if we're just all individuals and individual nuclear families, say, even bring it to that level, it becomes almost impossible to tell that family they can't come in.
Yeah.
And it should, that is our challenge, and it's the challenge that Nietzsche foresaw. Nietzsche really foresaw that that this drive that we have, this new values regime, as it became more prominent, was going to cause us to look back on our own history, look back on the actions that our ancestors took in order to get us to the position we're in now, and to relate to the rest of the world in a way that's going to demotivate and demoralize us, and make us incapable of defending what's been handed down to us. And that's the challenge. And we have to come up with we have to be able to argue for those reasons. Otherwise, there's not going to be anything to argue over pretty soon. So.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. We were supposed to talk about Winston Churchill, something you've probably not thought about in a long time, but
let's do you want to do a part 2 next week?
Yeah, let's do
a part 2. Yeah, because I got to get going.
Yeah,
but this is fun. I could talk to you for a lot longer. So let's do a part 2 next week.
Well, I appreciate your time. We'll leave it at a cliffhanger there, and appreciate you coming on, and I want people to check out your Martyr Made podcast. And anything else you'd like to mention going
on? No. Check out the podcast. The Martyr Made podcast is a long form history podcast. I do deep dives on everything from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the Jonestown cult, to the life and work of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. And something that's developed over the course of me making this podcast for almost a decade now. Is not something that I planned at the beginning or that I thought much about at the beginning of each episode as I was working on it, but that Girard is, if not mentioned explicitly, he's there in just about every episode.
Yeah. Well, I think one of these days we're going to get a 60-hour series on you analyzing the Bible, huh? How about that?
Oh, I'll tell you what, like if I didn't already have a subscriber base that was so used to me, telling them stories about Germans and Russians shooting at each other or whatever, and that's what they were kind of here for, I would talk about that stuff pretty much exclusively. That's what I would prefer to do, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate your time, sir. Thanks a lot. Darryl Cooper, thanks for coming on.
All right, brother. Talk to you next week then.
All right. Take care.